Hello and welcome, everyone. Our event today is called Integrating Indigenous Knowledge into Climate Displacement Decision Making. It's the fourth event in a four-part series called Climate Change and Human Migration. My name is Robert McLeman. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, and I'm a co-creator of this series. I'm joining you today from the shared traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is called the Dish of One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share and protect our resources and not to engage in conflict. From the Haldeman Proclamation of October 25th, 1784, this territory is described as being 6 miles deep from each side of the river, now known as the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in the proportion to the head of said river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. This proclamation was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. But despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of their original territory. Some of you today may be joining from other parts of the country, and I encourage you now to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the territory that you're occupying today. I'm pleased to introduce you all to our four outstanding speakers today. Our event will be moderated by Todd Kuiack, who is a former Canadian diplomat with postings in Mexico, Chile, and Cuba, and his last overseas posting was as ambassador to the Dominican Republic. He has also spent 5 years as the Director of Emergency Management at Indigenous Service Canada, where he was able to address the UN at the disaster risk reduction conferences in Montreal, Mexico, and Geneva. Todd is passionate about baseball as well as building community and is on the Indigenous Advisory Committee for the Toronto Blue Jays Care Foundation. He is currently the Director of Operations in Plans and Priorities at the Privy Council office in Ottawa, where he was named by the clerk as the Indigenous Champion. I would also like to introduce you today to Amy Cardinal Christianson, who is an Indigenous fire specialist at Parks Canada. Her research focuses on Indigenous fire stewardship, Indigenous wildland firefighters, wildfire evacuations, and Indigenous research methodologies. Since 2022, she has been a board member of the International Association of Wildland Fire. Amy also co-hosts the Good Fire podcast, which looks at Indigenous fire use around the world. She recently co-authored the books First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, a guide for communities and external agencies, as well as Blazing the Trail, celebrating Indigenous fire stewardship. I'd also like to introduce you to Simon Lambert, who is the newly appointed Chief Science Advisor, Māori, for the Ministry of the Environment in New Zealand. Prior to that, he spent 6 years as a professor at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Indigenous Studies, where his research focused on disaster risk reduction and emergency management with Indigenous communities, particularly for urban Indigenous groups. His recent work has been focused on collaborating with international Indigenous colleagues to promote Indigenous voices at the UN Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction. Miguel Sioui is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. His areas of expertise are in Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous land and water stewardship, environmental ethics, and environmental management. Miguel advocates for the integration of Indigenous knowledge into fields related to environmental management. In 2022, he contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report on integrating Indigenous responsibility-based thinking into climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. And later this year, his chapter, Indigenous Knowledge and the Way Forward, will be published by Oxford University Press in the collection entitled Canadian Politics and Policy. Let me thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and I will now pass the discussion and microphone over to you, Todd.
Thank you, Robert. Quick way, Mino Kijidad, Todd Kuiack, Nadishnakas, Anishinaabe Nini, Madawaska, Pikwaknagan, Nojaba. I'm very pleased to pass the mic to our first panelist, Miguel. Miguel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Todd, and thanks to everyone for attending. My name is Miguel Sioui. I'm a member of the Huron-Wendat First Nation, and so today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Indigenous knowledge systems and their vital role in terms of climate resilience, climate adaptation, mitigation, through some examples from my research and other Indigenous groups that I've interacted with and did research with over the last few years. And so, of course, global climate change has emerged as a very critical issue affecting Indigenous peoples worldwide, and it's presented multifaceted challenges that threaten traditional ways of life the world over, really. And so these challenges, of course, they vary from region to region, and this illustrates the localized manifestations of environmental change and its impact on Indigenous communities. And so, for instance, in the Yucatan Peninsula, home to the Maya people, rising temperatures there and also diminishing precipitation are leading to water scarcity, and this has affected agricultural practices and crop yields in recent years. And similarly, in the Canadian subarctic, the Decho Dene First Nations are grappling with the consequences of permafrost thaw, and you'll see a series of images that are playing at the same time that indicate this. And so this permafrost thaw and other localized manifestations of climate change in the subarctic has a tremendous impact on land-based livelihoods and cultural practices in the Decho. And the thawing of permafrost is profoundly impacting all dimensions of Dene land-based practices. It's leading to infrastructure damage, erosion, disruption of traditional activities, and even potential health risks as well. So it's a great threat to the livelihoods and the lives of Indigenous peoples in the subarctic and other regions across the Americas and throughout the world. But I think that something that's quite promising is that Indigenous groups like the Decho First Nations have been increasingly engaging in cultural adaptation strategies and initiatives, including programs like community-based monitoring, infrastructure upgrades, livelihood diversification, and other cultural preservation efforts as well. But these comprehensive solutions really require collaboration among governments, researchers, NGOs, and Indigenous communities themselves to ensure that sustainability and resilience in northern communities and other communities as well are able to thrive and to collectively come together and address permafrost thaw and other localized or regional manifestations of climate change. So Indigenous peoples have long viewed themselves as stewards of the land, and I'd say most Indigenous groups or communities are guided by a profound sense of responsibility toward the environment. And this perspective, which is rooted in Indigenous worldviews and cultural traditions, emphasizes the interconnectedness of all living beings and the imperative, really, the cultural imperative to care for the land. So for instance, this concept of responsibility-based thinking, as I've come to term it, among my own Huron-Wendat people and ancestors and other Indigenous communities really underscores the idea that humans have a duty and a responsibility to protect and preserve the environment, or simply the land, if we use a more Indigenous terminology, not only for our benefit as the current generation of people or humans living here, but also for future generations and the broader ecological community. So this holistic approach to environmental stewardship is deeply embedded in Indigenous knowledge systems, and it informs Indigenous responses to climate change as well. And increasingly, scientists and policymakers have been recognizing the value of Indigenous knowledge, or IK, in addressing these pressing global challenges like climate change and other environmental stewardship challenges as well. So IK encompasses traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, that is a knowledge system that's passed down through generations, oftentimes orally, and this offers insights into local ecosystems, weather patterns, sustainable land management practices, and just a whole host of other realities or conditions on the land on a day-to-day basis. For instance, and I believe Amy is going to address or speak to this, is the traditional practice of controlled burning among a large number of indigenous groups throughout the Americas and elsewhere. And so this has been shown to mitigate the risk of wildfires by reducing fuel accumulation and promoting general ecosystem health, among other things. And similarly, in present-day Mexico, the Yucatec Maya's longstanding and intimate cultural understanding of the local environment has enabled this community, this group, this indigenous group, to develop resilient agricultural techniques and practices that are very much situated to their region's climate conditions and environmental realities in the Yucatan today. So indigenous peoples in this sense have been drawing on their deep connection to the land, and they're leading a multitude of efforts to reimagine or reconsider humanity's relationship with the earth or the land, and advocate for more inclusive and equitable approaches to environmental governance as well. So there's a tremendous and deep value, I believe, in terms of indigenous knowledge and climate change mitigation adaptation practices and policy as well. And as I've said, scientists and policymakers the world over have begun to recognize the value of indigenous knowledge in addressing climate change and other environmental stewardship challenges. So there's a lot to learn from indigenous peoples in this regard, I believe. And so indigenous knowledge systems are oftentimes rooted in what indigenous scholars have described as a relational worldview. And so this relational worldview has offered valuable insights into the very complex interplay between human beings and their various environments. So for example, among the Decho First Nations in the Northwest Territories, traditional teachings and Dene law emphasize this interconnectedness of all living beings and a reciprocal relationship between humans and the natural world. So in this sense, the concept of responsibility-based thinking underscores, again, indigenous peoples' ethical commitment to caring for the land and also honoring ancestral ties to the environment through various land use activities that are carried out on a day-to-day basis in indigenous communities. So this perspective, this cultural approach, really it's quite different from Western approaches to environmental management and relationships with the environment. And those Western approaches, you could say, are more predicated on rights-based frameworks, which prioritize individual entitlements over collective responsibilities to the land. And so I certainly believe that responsibility-based approaches offer a more holistic understanding of human-environment relationships that are grounded in principles of reciprocity and mutual respect. And so incorporating some of these principles, a more responsibility-based approach to land use and management, I believe, requires a shift away from linear or text-based forms of knowledge transmission towards more experiential and relational modes of learning that are innate in indigenous approaches. So for instance, the oral tradition of storytelling among the Yucatec Maya, the Decho First Nations as well, and virtually all indigenous peoples the world over, serves as a means of passing down ecological knowledge from one generation to the next, and this preserves traditional wisdom in the face of environmental change. In Arctic regions, Inuit elders play a crucial role in transmitting traditional ecological knowledge to younger generations through this relational kind of direct experience and oral storytelling, as I've been describing. And so this intimate understanding of different aspects or elements, in this in the natural world or the environment or the land, includes an understanding of sea ice dynamics, wildlife behavior, and weather patterns, that's all essential for survival in Arctic environments. And so by engaging in activities like hunting, fishing, navigation, and ceremonial land use practices, Inuit land users in the Arctic learn firsthand about the importance of respecting and protecting this delicate balance in the Arctic ecosystem. So I believe that incorporating this responsibility-based approach and way of thinking into environmental governance in Canada and elsewhere requires embracing experiential and relational modes of learning that honor this interconnectedness of humans and the environment. So some lessons learned, just to wrap up this this discussion on IK and its vital role in climate policy and climate change adaptation and mitigation, is that firstly, I believe that Indigenous communities emphasize the importance of adaptation and resilience in responding to climate and other environmental changes. And so rather than viewing nature as static or fixed, Indigenous peoples understand that ecosystems are dynamic and interconnected, requiring flexible strategies to cope with shifting conditions. So for example, the Yucatec Maya, have been practicing milpa-based agriculture for over 5,000 years in the Yucatan. And so they've been directly responsible, for managing these ecosystems within the Yucatan Peninsula, and through observation, ceremonial land use practices, and all of this kind of framework based in a cultural precept of respect for the environment and responsibility-based thinking, they've been able to withstand many, many changes, over this 5,000-year period, and probably most recently colonialism and complete upheaval of their cultural land use practices and governance systems. And today, as I've done research with the Yucatec Maya over the last few years, especially during my PhD research, I've learned that their land use systems are very capable of dealing with uncertainty and change and fluctuations in rainfall and temperature, for instance. I think that another key lesson is that Indigenous stewardship practices prioritize holistic and cross-cultural approaches to land and water management. And so, for instance, we hear about terms like two-eyed seeing that was developed by Mi'kmaq elder Dr. Albert Marshall, and ways of thinking that are able to incorporate and integrate different cultural knowledge systems into one land management approach. We're embracing Western scientific knowledge as well as traditional cultural systems to developing more complete, comprehensive, or holistic land management systems. And I think, lastly, Indigenous stewardship is grounded in principles of intergenerational equity and responsibility. And so this ensures that resources and the environment in general are managed sustainably for future generations. So through these customary laws like Dene law in Northern Canada and other cultural traditions, Indigenous communities prioritize the preservation of land and water for the well-being of all human and other than human beings and our relatives, so to speak, for generations to come. So just to sum up my discussion here, Indigenous perspectives on land stewardship offer very valuable insights into sustainable land-based relationships and climate change adaptation as well. And I think that there's a lot to learn from Indigenous knowledge systems through supporting especially Indigenous-led research initiatives, community-based approaches to research and climate change adaptation. And in this way, we can build towards a more resilient and equitable future for all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in the face of these increasingly complex global challenges such as climate change. So
what a great start. What a great start. Great perspective. Thank you so much, Miguel. Now, I'd love to introduce our second panelist, Amy. Thank you so much for being here today, Amy. It's great to see you again. I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Okay, Tensei Todd. So thanks so much for having me here today. My name's Amy Cardinal Christianson. I'm Métis from Treaty 8 territories, that's northern Alberta. My family is the Cardinal and Labakan families, and they're from Pieces C-SPAN, which was disenfranchised by the Canadian government after the Northwest resistance. And yeah, I'm currently in Treaty 6 territory, and I live in a little town called Rocky Mountain House. So the reason I'm mentioning that is because, where I live is we're a part of fires. So we had a lot of fires last year. We're probably ramping up again for another big season with the drought we're in Alberta. So yeah, I'm going to present today specifically on wildfire and on First Nation wildfire evacuations. So next slide, please. So maybe I can just explain about the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership. So this was oh, there we go. A group of researchers that were brought together, First Nation communities who were evacuated in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and then agencies responsible for conducting or providing support during these evacuations. And I think, Todd, this was where we met, was around this initiative. So it started in 2013, but most of the evacuations that we studied were between 2011 and 2016. So next slide, please. And so I just wanted to give some background on why this was important. So in Canada, this is the wildland fire area burned between 1980 and 2021. This doesn't include the 2023 season, which again, we saw unprecedented fires across Canada. But I can tell you that from this map, much of what burned in 2023 was in these areas that experience recurrent burns. There's lots of fire activity on the landscape, but what we saw that was different was really the amount of high intensity and high severity wildfires and that occurred across Canada starting in April and then occurring all the way until the end of September. So it was a very long summer. Next slide. And so when we look at wildland fire evacuations, our map basically follows the same thing. So these are communities that were evacuated between 1980 and 2021. And so the gray dots are non-Indigenous communities, and then the orange dots are Indigenous communities. So these don't have to be reserves. This is just communities that we've identified as having greater than 50% Indigenous populations. And so the bigger the dot, the bigger the number of evacuees. So again, we can see throughout Kuiack, throughout the entire boreal forest, and then a real hotspot in the interior of British Columbia. And again, next slide. Sorry, I'll get into it in a second. Okay, so looking at percentage of evacuation orders. So these are only orders, they're not alerts, but communities that actually had to leave is the first column there, and then percentage of evacuees. So that's people who were evacuated. And so British Columbia has the greatest number of evacuation events and evacuees. Alberta actually comes in second for the number of evacuees. But lots of that was because of the city of Fort McMurray, which was 100,000 people that were evacuated in one event. So it kind of skews our results a little bit. And then again, we go through, so British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, basically all the provinces that you would kind of expect to see evacuations. But what I would say is that no one has been unaffected by wildfire evacuations across Canada. Well, none of it right now. We haven't had any evacuations, but that's really the only place across, or the only territory in Canada. Next slide. So this one is evacuation start and end date. So it looks a little confusing, but I'll walk you through. So on the left is, the national picture, BC, Alberta, Ontario going down. And across the top, we have the months of the year. So January, February, March, April, and then May, June, July, August, which is usually when we see the most wildfire evacuations. And so the length of the line is also how long the evacuation was. And so usually our duration of evacuation in Canada is about 8 days for a wildfire evacuation where people are out of their home. But what we see is that it's much longer for Indigenous peoples, and that there still are many, many communities that were evacuated from wildfire, had significant impacts, who still aren't home. So we see that in Lytton, we see Little Red River Cree Nation up north. In Manitoba, there's still people out. So it's something, to really consider, is that even though, these kind of show an end date, there's a lot of evacuations that are still unresolved. And this gets into this whole idea of migration of people, and that people are still, living, being impacted by evacuations that might have happened years ago to them. So again, to point out in this picture, BC usually has their evacuations in July and August, so later in the summer. Alberta is kind of a bit of an outlier because the evacuations usually occur in May and June. So you can see kind of the dark spot there. So that's So what we saw last year was really similar to what we normally see. But again, we sometimes see evacuations in December in Alberta from wildfire. And so really almost every single month of the year might have wildfire evacuations depending on the conditions. Next slide. So what's really important to point out is that about 5% of the Canadian population identifies as Indigenous. We have a lot of urban Indigenous people or Indigenous people who don't live in Indigenous communities. So what's even more unprecedented is that of those communities with greater than 50% Indigenous population, they make up 42% of wildfire evacuation events in Canada. So these people are incredibly disproportionately impacted by wildfire, and the bad part is are mainly kept out of decision making about wildfire on their landscapes. Next slide. So again, turning back to the partnership, the First Nation Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, what happened with this was that we were hearing a lot from agencies and other people about what it was like, dealing with First Nations, issues with jurisdiction. But at that point, no one had really talked to people that were members of those communities. So we formed partnerships with 6 or 7 different communities across Canada, and they're on the stars there, where they had recently been evacuated. Quite a few actually were air evacuations, so where the Department of Defense was required to come in and help them evacuate their communities. And so what we did was we ended up talking to people about these experiences. Next slide. So we used at that time qualitative social science research methods. We had research assistants from communities who did the research. We had band council resolutions from all the different First Nations that we worked with who helped lead what we were looking at in each community. And then we did a ton of field work. So more than 200 interviews were conducted with evacuees, leaders, and residents who stayed behind, which is another important thing that I'll get into. And so we spoke to both youth, adults, and elders. Next slide. So we did publish a bunch of academic papers on this, but what I would point people to is the book that we developed. So First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, and you can find it on Amazon or UBC Press. And it really takes a very in-depth look at evacuations, but through stories. And so it's a really, I think, easy read that also goes into a bunch of different recommendations. So for both communities that they can take when preparing for and going through evacuation, and also for external agencies when they're, having to work with Indigenous communities. And so the book goes through every chapter is a different stage. So deciding to evacuate, for example, seeing a fire on the landscape, putting a plan into motion, troubleshooting transportation, like how do we get people out of the community, finding accommodations, taking care of evacuees, and returning home. And so there were many bad stories that we heard about. There was also lots of good things. And so some of the nations, for example, Lac La Ronge Indian Band with Stanley Mission, they were great at their evacuation until they encountered the external jurisdiction and all the other issues. Another thing is returning home and the problem with finances. So many nations are expected to pay upfront for evacuation costs. They are then can claim some of these costs, but almost all the communities that we talked to were hundreds of thousands out of pocket in evacuation costs that they weren't going to get reimbursed for, which can be devastating to a community that's already, dealing with financial issues. Next slide. And so again, don't look too hard at this. I know it's probably very small text on everyone's screen, but I just wanted to point you to this infographic that's available on the website for the partnership. And this is real practical steps that agencies can take for dealing with communities, and also for communities to look at. What I really wanted to focus on was staying behind. So we often act like in evacuations, that the media always picks up on, oh, there's people that are staying behind and disobeying evacuation orders. But this happens during every single evacuation. This is not a new thing. And people, we need to start working with people who are making that decision to stay behind rather than like criminalizing them in our minds. So Lots of people have very good reasons for staying behind. Lots have very good knowledge that will keep them safe when they stay behind. Again, so it's just kind of having that education piece and working with those people on positive things that they can bring to the evacuation. Next slide. So, why are we seeing all these evacuations across Canada? So, we have increasing risk. And I know this webinar is focused on climate change, which of course is contributing to our risk. There's lots of great physical science coming out about that. There's lots of elders who often speak to, the changing conditions in their territories. But with fire, there's also other things that are causing problems. And so one is fire exclusion. So we're really good at putting out fires in Canada, right? That's what most people say. But that's led to incredible fuel buildups through fire exclusion and fire suppression on the landscape, as well as forest management practices. So the idea of cut blocks and leaving tons of slash that's then available to burn, and new research is coming out showing how much better like fire will move and how much more intensely it will burn through those cut blocks. So yeah, there's lots of different things. Also, like the idea of kind of monocultures or promoting certain species to burn, and then expansion of the wildland urban interface into areas that are of high risk for wildfire. Next slide. So as Miguel kind of mentioned earlier, all of my work at the moment is now around Indigenous cultural burning practices. So this is how Indigenous people sought to replace fires of choice or fires of chance across the landscape. So lightning caused fires, or arson caused fires, with fires of choice. And so commonly across Canada, you hear it referred to as cleaning the land. And I actually haven't met a nation yet, from like east to west coast to the north in Canada, that didn't use fire in some capacity. But the difference between cultural fire and what we see agencies do now with prescribed fire is that we were using fire to achieve specific cultural objectives. And so one side benefit of that was that, yes, it would reduce the risk. But the quotes were that they didn't set the forest on fire just for the sake of burning, but so that they could return to hunt the next year and live. And I just wanted to add too that lots of people think like this is this practice isn't occurring, or that the knowledge has all been like lost or taken from us through colonization. But you know what, we were out burning yesterday. We had a beautiful burn window here. We were out on the landscape doing it. It's when you know the time to burn, it's a very low risk activity when you follow proper governance and protocols. So next slide. Sorry, that's just the so yeah, looking here, you can see on the left, the top left is basically what we used to see on the Canadian landscape. Lots of open patches. You had mixed mosaic forests, lots of biodiversity. On kind of there's a small cultural burn going on, as well as a lightning strike up in the mountains. But things are just burning like with really good severity. Nothing's getting too burnt. Then in the middle one, it shows when we started suppressing fires. So you can see the vegetation really growing in. We're losing those meadows. And then on the bottom is what we're seeing with those really high intensity fires where they're burning the entire thing. And it's because there's no mosaic or biodiversity on the landscape. It's just burning through the entire forest. Next slide. So issues at the moment, I know we're going to get into this more in the question period, but there's low recognition of Indigenous expertise related to fire. There's massive power dynamics related to Indigenous sovereignty and land back movements. Many Indigenous people don't even have land that they could steward. There's non-Indigenous interest and appropriation of this knowledge. There's no sustained funding. So we get a lot of funding for one burn, but not any sort of like landscape scale stewardship. There's one-off projects and overwhelming requests. And to me, it comes down to a social justice issue. As I said, we're the people that are most impacted by fire in Canada, yet have the least power in any sort of decisions around it. And so I think that's my last slide there. Just a thank you. Thank you for the subtle clues there, Todd. That worked well.
Merci, Amy. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm now going to invite my old friend, Simon, to present next. Kia ora, Simon. And thank you very much for joining us this early in the morning from Auckland. I am beyond impressed. Over to you. And we'll come back to you, Amy and Miguel, in the questions and answers.
Oh, kia ora Todd, kia ora koutou. Thank you, Miguel and Amy, for setting the path there. Yes, my name is Simon Lambert. We all wear many hats, and I'm currently Chief Science Advisor Māori for the Ministry for the Environment. Back in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I want to acknowledge my friends from Treaty 6 territory and my Métis friends too in Saskatchewan. Spent several lovely years there in the Indigenous Studies Department at the university, and continued my research, which was on disaster risk reduction in Indigenous communities. And I started that after a series of earthquakes here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, 2011. Christchurch, which is where I live now. It's in the South Island, just visiting the Auckland metropolis at the moment. And what I was seeing there was, and we were working with urban Māori. And so this, and it's come up several times already. It's something we even are reluctant to talk of ourselves, that we're actually primarily an urban people now here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have been since my father's generation. Around the world, Indigenous peoples are going to the cities, to towns, to urban areas. And why wouldn't you? They're exciting. There's always something going on. There's cinema, there's education, there's health services, there's all these things. And so we have this issue of disconnection from our traditional territories. And if you get disconnected from the land, and again, this is implicit in the conversation so far, you can't help but have a less solid relationship with culture, with language, with elders, with knowledge keepers, and so on. And so we've been dealing with this as Māori, as I say now, for 2 going into 3 generations. And I hear similar stories around the world that people are losing languages, losing cultural practices, losing direct access to traditional territories. So when we talk of disasters, I mean, what is the primary disaster that all Indigenous peoples are dealing with? Is colonization. We are still responding to colonization. All right. So why can we not better mitigate wildfires on our territories? Colonization has undermined our rights and or the rights and the ability of people to govern themselves in a safe manner, to mitigate, avoid, remedy the hazards that they have often, intergenerational experience of, but over millennia, right? I also want to give a shout out to a friend of ours, Todd, John Scott, Tlingit tribal member who's been working in the DRR space for, probably over 2 decades now, based in and around Washington, D.C., lobbying for attention for space, for resourcing for Indigenous peoples. And so he was, and others were pulling us together in the UN DRR space. And there's quite a number of publications out there. It's you can Google them, the marvels of modern technology. It's all out there. We almost have too much information, right? How can we distill what we need to know? There's a publication that UNISDR put out, and John was one of the co-authors on that. It's over 10 years ago now, but it was just simple steps that local government leaders could take to reduce their disaster risks. And I'll run through them shortly. And what we're seeing now, as I say, I now work for the New Zealand government, still keep my hand in some research and still doing research through the University of Saskatchewan. But government states everywhere are struggling to get ahead of the curve in this, what we could call a triple planetary crisis. There's climate change, there's biodiversity loss, and there's pollution. All governments are struggling to deal with that. One of the patterns in liberal democracies we see now is the devolution of power to local governments. And Indigenous governments, Indigenous communities can actually benefit from this in the sense that they will get the ability and the space to take more decision-making roles. All right, as the state steps back out of a very overt control of land, of territory, and the environment, and so on. However, there's still a huge challenge there, because what are the local government leaders to do? You've got so many issues to deal with. Anyway, the UNISDR put out this basic checklist, a handbook for local government leaders, and the first one they have is place organizations in place and coordinate understanding to reduce disaster risk. Simply have a structure, citizen group, civil society that has that on the agenda, literally an agenda item, right? and build local alliances. And John Scott, of course, went through all this and goes, well, what does this mean for Indigenous peoples? And quite simply, respect the institutions and organizations of Indigenous peoples when building these alliances and coordinating disaster risk reduction. Amy mentioned money earlier, and it's going to come up in all discussions with Indigenous peoples. If there's a budget for disaster risk reduction and there's incentives for homeowners and communities to in some way manage the risks that they're seeing, there need to be culturally appropriate incentives for Indigenous communities. We have a cultural response to these things. All communities have culture. Our cultures have great ancient roots in the land and the territory and huge understanding, as Miguel outlined, in Indigenous knowledges. And a key thing too we see is the need to have up-to-date data on hazards and vulnerabilities. This is a rapidly changing space. I get a news feed on various disaster research projects, and I see these lines on the sea temperature for the Pacific and the Atlantic. Others may be watching this as well, and there are some significant physical changes to our environment, which have been predicted for many years, but we actually lack the data at local level. You know, I know the sea temperature of the Atlantic and the Canadian North. I know that this is serious. I know that it's important. But what does that mean for my community several thousand miles away? Data is expensive to gather. There is no guarantee that a research institute or a department will have the budget to maintain long-term data. We are seeing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, some really important databases running out of funding. And sometimes you look at the funding and it's kind of nickel and dimes, but there's someone somewhere with an Excel spreadsheet making decisions on which data is collected and how it's communicated. So again, in that space, we need to disaggregate data by sex, by ethnicity, and ensure that languages are noted and that we can disseminate this with including traditional means of communication, which will be oral. We need to be able to communicate complex issues in a simple manner for all communities, and in our communities, have that culturally framed communication method. We need to invest in critical infrastructure to reduce hazards and risks. Floods and fires seem to be predominant now around the world. Here in New Zealand, we are having wildfires, which we didn't before. We looked across Tasman Sea to our friends in Australia, and again, they also have cultural burning practices there. And you'll get occasionally, it wasn't such a bad season, but you'll see these beautiful orange sunsets and sunrises here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because our friends across in Australia are having a particularly bad wildfire season. People forget that before COVID, there was a number of mega fires, California and in Australia. You may remember images of tourists gathering on the beach in Australia to escape the smoke and flames. Then there's COVID, and we kind of, a very human response, we kind of partition out really, really terrible things and try and just focus on what's immediately in front of us. So again, for local Indigenous leaders, they are juggling so many different things. Any point of their day, 24/7, they can get a text message, a phone call, emergency, disaster response, all right? And then the recovery after that takes a huge amount of efforts and time, and you have a cascading next urgency, next disaster to deal with. So again, that investment in critical infrastructure, very, very difficult for our communities, and it needs to be in collaboration with the relevant Indigenous communities, the ones who actually have that connection to land and territory. Schools and health facilities are very important, so upgrading those, and again, in collaboration with the relevant Indigenous communities and their leaders. Realistic risk-compliant regulations and land use planning principles, right? Identifying safe land for our communities, upgrading informal settlements wherever possible. What we're seeing in recoveries is that people will slap together some emergency housing, or they'll be living in a trailer, car or something. This is actually becoming a standard recovery, and there is not the resources to then rebuild safe, well-located housing, and unfortunately it just builds in place the next disaster, right? So health disasters, mold, overcrowding, all these sorts of things our communities are having to face because we are responding continually to evacuations to disasters, relocating communities, and so on. And so taking into account our land use practices, education programs, training, all right, again, bringing in our languages, our culturally framed approaches to teaching, to education, to learning, bringing in our leadership and using local Indigenous institutions when and where possible. Ecosystems have come up time and time again. What are nature-based solutions? Many of you will be familiar with that term. How can climate adaptation plans and measures appropriately work in with our knowledge holders? Early warning systems. There's been a lot of research projects using Indigenous knowledges around early warning systems. Again, how can these integrate traditional practices? But of course, when we have these traditional early warning systems, it doesn't mean that we don't use our phones. Google, we don't, I Google the weather wherever I go. I mean, there's technology out there, and it's just as any new technology available to our peoples in the past. They interrogated it. They saw how they could adapt it to their means, to their lifestyles. We see this in hunting. We see this in fishing. We're not going to use tools that are 1,000 years old to address these issues. We expect, in fact, demand as a right, access to all the latest technologies that will help us plan and adapt to climate change. And finally, taking into account Indigenous spiritual healing systems and medicine practices. What we actually have is a crisis of anxiety. We have mental health concerns around the world. We have increasing youth anxiety. I mean, what is the message we send to young people around the world when you say, oh, look, sorry, but we're screwed. We're all going to be burning in 12 years' time, and et cetera, and people, the richest people, are building rockets and looking at leaving the planet. What is the message to young people? How do we expect them to interpret all this? I mean, they are actually now in a time of climate anxiety. It's becoming universal. And Indigenous peoples have, in many ways, regrettably, had to deal with the anxiety of massive change, radical change, of losing power and control over land and environment and communities through colonization. We have these incredibly resilient spiritual systems that some people have cherry-picked and Googled and cut and paste and tried to frame up as some sort of, often a business, but it is out there, and it is something that many Indigenous leaders are more than happy to share and more than happy to make available if it is done in an appropriate and respectful manner. I could talk all day, Todd. You know that. There's three key things that I see Indigenous peoples dealing with in this time of climate change. One is the vulnerability of livelihoods. So we still have many people in rural areas. We still have people who maintain what we could call traditional lifestyles, hunting and fishing and all that. The ecosystems are under, the second thing being those ecosystems are declining. They're under huge pressures, right, from climate change. And from the third thing I'd point out, unsustainable development. Too often our traditional lands and territories, we've lost control of them. We have unsustainable development put on them, whether it's resource extraction, whether it's urban sprawl, whether it's pollution. And so this maldevelopment, maladaptation, now we're seeing that at a scale where we're starting to run out of safe places to live. I'll finish with one story. I'll finish this part with one story. I was in New York at a UN DRR event last year. I'm walking down the street. I recognize a Pacific elder, and I greet him, and we have a conversation. He was from Kiribati, series of very low-lying atolls. And I'd remembered a news item from some time ago when the Kiribati government purchased about 500 hectares in Fiji as a possible refuge from sea level rise. What happened was that, well, understand it from an Indigenous perspective. How do you purchase somebody else's land? And what the elder said is, and he held up his hands like this and goes, well, we may own the land, but the land is not ours. What we have is a whole lot of communities having to move from their traditional territories to other people's territories. All right, we are actually relying on charity. And if you step back and take that even further, are we looking at the recolonization of Indigenous peoples as we see a so-called managed retreat from high-risk zones, coastal areas, floodplains, and so on? And are we going to lose control again of our lands and territories as non-Indigenous peoples look for somewhere else to live? Kia ora.
Gee, Megwich Nitawa Simon, I really enjoy talking to you and listening. I'm always conscious of the fact that here we are bringing in 3 Indigenous experts to talk about traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledges, and then cutting them off because, you know, we want to get to questions and answers. So we want to hear your voices, but we've only given you so much time. So I have made a conscious decision to cut back the panel discussion into, instead of this being a long, drawn out affair, I'm going to do kind of rapid questions, and then that's going to allow for time for questions and answers because we really want our audience to participate today. So Miguel, I'm going to bring you back into it right away. I'm just going to ask you a very straightforward questions. In what way do traditional academic structures create barriers for integrating Indigenous knowledge into fields related to environmental management or policy making? I wonder if you could address that in a minute and a half.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Todd.
Cheers.
Yeah, well, I think it all boils down to one point that I addressed in my presentation about really a disconnect, a chasm between Western linear thinking approaches and Indigenous circular or relational approaches to just living, being with living with the land essentially. So Western institutions have, of course, historically prioritized these linear cause and effect models of understanding the world around us, including the land or the environment. And so this emphasizes not indigenous, but individual rights and a very compartmentalized approach to decision making as well in terms of land use and management. And so in contrast, Indigenous knowledge systems tend to be holistic and interconnected and relational. And I think that that's a point that was spoken to by all 3 of us today, Amy, and as well as Simon. And so I think that that's where the challenge lies. Really, it's bridging that gap, and making sure that Indigenous perspectives that prioritize collective responsibility and stewardship over individual entitlement and rights. We really have to address that issue right there. I think that that's what's at stake, and when we're talking about these challenges and barriers. And academia, of course, has been very complicit in this and has been really kind of a knowledge production and generation arm of these colonial institutions through time and still today. So yeah,
that's an amazing answer for a minute and a half. Honestly, I could listen to that, I'm sure, an entire lecture, if not an entire course. So I'm going to go to Amy at this point, a fellow civil servant. And perhaps this question might, lead us into some further discussion. But we've been encouraged all along as Indigenous people and as people working with Indigenous peoples on emergency management, on climate adaptation, etc., when incorporating traditional knowledge to consider solutions not as products, but as part of the process. What are some of the challenges or barriers you've seen when trying to integrate Indigenous knowledge with Western knowledge, either in government or in research environments? So I wonder, Amy, if you might be able to speak to that.
Sure, thanks, Todd. So for me, I think, I'm actually trying to move away from the terms of like braiding, integrating those things, because what I'm seeing is just this danger with it. And so for fire, for example, with cultural fire practices, a lot of wildfire management agencies want to integrate or include cultural fire in their current existing programs. But basically, what I'm finding is that it means that they want to take the parts that they like and put it into their programs to kind of give them, reasoning behind what they're doing, or to kind of get public buy-in, but then excluding the parts that they maybe don't like the cultural things, the spiritual elements, who should be involved and who should be there. And so for me, that's been really difficult with fire, because I think my thing has always been Indigenous leadership in this area. So now when I'm talking about like government integrating or, having Indigenous programs, it's through Indigenous led initiatives. And so for money going directly to communities who want to do this work, rather than, government creating a new, group to integrate this knowledge, right? Like, let's give the money to communities and some power devolution there, and see what the nations can do.
I think that's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. So, Simon, I'm going to come back to you. I didn't give you much of a break there, but I'm wondering, you've been talking about data, and I think that's really important in these days. Data collection, and of course, the ever-present aspect of AI will factor into the way forward. How can non-Indigenous researchers and policymakers best connect with Indigenous communities in a respectful and mutually beneficial manner to go develop solutions for environmental management and climate adaptation?
The data landscape is really and rapidly changing, right? And actually, I was in conversations just yesterday on exactly this. And so Indigenous peoples in our demands for sovereignty include data in that. So we talk of data sovereignty, that actually the data that emanates from our communities, from our lands, our waters, our resources, we actually claim that data, right? So it's a really in some respects contentious. It's like any ownership issue. The data sciences are a very natural technological expression of the human anxiety of simply not knowing what's going on now and into the future. And we also want to know what has happened in the past. Current data landscapes are dominated by privately owned planetary scale computation models and technologies that elevate, let's be honest, instantaneous trivial desires and produce some pretty negative social effects. I mean, protecting our young people from the worst of what can happen on the internet it's 24/7, right? When we look at how non-Indigenous groups, organizations, peoples, and let's include governments in that, can contribute, if we just looked at the data space, we are stacking data, right? There's this concept of stacking data in an integrated way, making stuff available. There's modularity. Stuff is programmable, flexible, tweakable, customizable for our own purposes and needs. Equitable, I mean, hardware, software, justice. How can we have the latest and we can't even update stuff for the latest software in time because of the download speeds and the costs and so on. How can it be responsive? How can it be sustainable into across multiple generations? How can we have sensing and modeling in the climate space that enables us to respond in real time to protect our communities? And we've seen a lot over the last few years with COVID, a very data-heavy response. Climate change is demanding that same sort of response, and we expect our non-Indigenous partners and allies to understand and work in with us in that data space.
Thank you for that, Simon. I just being told that there's a few questions coming in, but I'm going to ask one more question from each of you, and I'll start in, again, reverse order. We'll go with Miguel. We're just going to ask each and every one of you, what is the one thing, you've had your time to speak a little bit, wish we could have given a little bit more. We've asked just one kind of a general question, but what is the one thing that you want us, all of these viewers, there's over 1,000 people online today, all public servants working in this space, what is the one thing that you want them to take away from this this session?
Yeah, thank you, Todd. That's a great question. I think that as a final reflection, I believe that, again, this Indigenous, responsibility-based thinking that I've just kind of been talking about since the beginning of this event today, it offers really invaluable lessons and perspectives in my mind. I remember this one Maya elder, who I was interviewing for my PhD research, talked about the concept of ge'ech, which means change in the Maya language, and how that's a term, a concept that's embedded in the Maya cultural land use and management strategy. It's been that way for, probably thousands of years. So that recognition that change is just a constant. You know, it's a normal way of doing things. It's just you know, innate in the environment, and so it should be in our management practices as well, and in our relationships with the land. You know, and I think that once you recognize and accept uncertainty and change, then it necessarily leads to a responsibility-based way of thinking about the land and approaching our relationships as human stewards, you know, in all our dealings with our relatives on the land, human and other than human beings, as well as generations to come in the future. So I think that it's definitely a perspective and approach that could allow us to re-envision our relationship as a global society with the environment, and the way in which we react to and address climate change as well, and other, you know, major environmental issues of the present day.
Thank you so much. And Amy, I'm going to pass to you. Same question with the same 1,000 people that are watching, all public servants looking to work with Indigenous partners to tackle this climate change issues. What is the one thing that you're trying to communicate today?
Sure. So I'll just go for it and say funding. There is a lot of money in this space right now, but we are seeing very little actually going to Indigenous communities in Canada when we consider the entire pot. There's a lot of money now going to research, going to academic institutes, to non-Indigenous researchers, being, you know, money going to universities for that work. We're seeing, you know, government departments, as I said, kind of ramping up employees and other people in these areas to administer programs. But again, very little is actually getting onto the ground. And so I just wanted to commend the efforts of like ECCC, Environment Canada and Climate Change, and the First Nation National Guardian Network. And so that's a movement where the money is going directly through that Indigenous-led group to communities to form guardian programs in nations. And so me, that's the future. That's a really great idea of collaboration and funding going directly to people that need it. So yeah, I hope that one day we'll see the same thing in fire. Thanks, Todd.
Absolutely. Thank you. Simon, same question. One last thing.
And
then we'll get into the questions, which will the points will really add up there.
So what I would say is that if you want to know what communities, non-Indigenous communities, are going to have to deal with, look at Indigenous communities. That our histories regrettably provide a template for what happens when communities lose control of land, of water, of territories, are forced to be mobile when they don't want to be, are forced to be sedentary when they don't want to be. So we are now seeing this huge flux, and Canada is going to have it as bad as anywhere, where entire infrastructure and communities are going to have to move. Well, you have a history of that. We know that this has taken place in the past, and I think, again, regrettably, non-Indigenous peoples will be facing the same pressures, losing control, losing assets, having their investment portfolios evaporate overnight because of extreme weather events and so on. So regrettably, look to our communities to how to respond to that, and how to maintain unity as best you can, and how to display this resilience that we sort of talk about all the time. But that resilience has come from learning to respond to some, you know, externally imposed vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I'm going to jump into the questions, and I think this one's for you, Amy. What is causing these large, massive fires this last year?
Okay, yeah, so I guess I'll go to my area. So where my family's from, so that is Treaty 8 territory, Lac La Biche, Fort McMurray. And so what we see there is an area that has both had massive industrial impact, as you know, from the oil sands development, as well as forest management companies and the extraction of timber resources, and then the exclusion of Indigenous fire practices across that entire landscape. So what we tend to see then is the promotion, as I said, of monocultures, so these kind of coniferous forest blankets. Like, you know, when you go to the mountains and you look out and you see all these beautiful, you know, solid green landscape, like that is not beautiful. We have to get that out of our thinking. that is an area that's prone to disturbance. And so that's what we saw in Fort McMurray too. And then because of how dry it is up there, the drought, the lack of precipitation, the warmer temperatures that we're seeing, what we're also seeing is that areas that would burn once and then not burn for 80 or 100 years after are reburning within 3 or 5 years. And then with that reburn, we're getting really significant impacts on the landscape, which is then impacting water and other things. And the water and fire are tied so delicately together that then that's influencing, you know, drinking water, other things for nations. So yeah, I mean, I could go on and on, but I know we're trying to get to a bunch of different questions. Thanks.
Right. No, that's great. And I think, you know, there's a lot of information in the system on there. I know ECCC has released a lot of information there and can on forest fires, but also the role of greenhouse gases in climate change is, I think, a big one that everyone's been looking at. So I'm going to ask the question, it's actually for anyone, how can non-Indigenous peoples learn to and work with Indigenous knowledge without being cultural appropriators? And I'm wondering, Miguel or Simon, either of you can jump in on this, or Amy, if you want to answer again, but I'm going to try to work in the other panelists. Simon, you look like you're leaning in.
I was, it's a constant thing, and it's one of those things, be careful what you ask for. Right. So Indigenous peoples have asked to be included, then suddenly it becomes difficult. Non-Indigenous people want to cooperate, collaborate. I mean, if we're all coming from a place of equal power, then you will have you know, equal exchange and collaborative and synthesis and so on, all these things that we want. Gosh, you know, face to face, we always want to work face to face. You want to establish a relationship. You want to look people in the eye, you get that trust. All right. It's fundamental to all cultures. It's really, really tricky. It's situations are often they're often on a knife edge. And I've seen this in universities. So if you have a program and then everything's going well and one person leaves, and everything falls over, or you lose an elder or something, and it's based on relationships, it's very, very vulnerable. So no answer, but appreciate the complexities, the dynamism, and the vulnerability of the Indigenous participants. They've got communities behind them that have got their own dynamics and their own agendas and all that, and no individual's in control of everything. And so it's very, very difficult to have sustainable long-term relationships where in institutions, government, academic, research, where you know, programs change because of funding or governments or so on. I appreciate the complexities. Right?
Oh, definitely. It's a start, though. I really appreciate that. Miguel, I'm going to ask you the question, then bring you back into it. What are the factors limiting the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in government decisions, and I would say academic as well, on solutions to climate change-induced migration?
You know, well, I would give essentially the same answer, you know, along the same lines as the previous question that you posed about some of the barriers. You know, really it relates to two fundamentally different perspectives and worldviews about the role of human beings, you know, our position in relation to the environment and environmental management, if you will. So I think that, you know, in order to spark change in this regard, positive change, it comes down to, I think, what Simon essentially was referring to, and that's really humility. You know, approaching things from a position of humility, especially as non-Indigenous allies and people interested in working with, you know, and bridging those gaps, and overcoming those barriers is, you know, when I speak about Canada or the Americas, you know, because my expertise is, you know, in terms of Indigenous groups in the Americas, wherever you are in Canada, in the U.S. or Colombia or Chile, you know, there's an Indigenous people that have learned to develop a relationship with the surrounding environment in familial terms. You know, these people love the land that they come from. It inspires them, it nourishes them. So of course, you know, over thousands of years, they've developed knowledge systems that are based on love, you know, love for the land, care for the land. So there's such profound and immense value in that way of thinking, and you know, when you're approaching Indigenous groups for research or for collaborative policy decisions, whether it's climate change or other environmental issues. I think that what's needed here is humility again, and recognizing that you're a guest on the land, and you're the one that's seeking knowledge. You're the one that's seeking information from these millennia-old knowledge systems that have such profound and tremendous value for the rest of humanity, really, not only for Indigenous peoples ourselves. So that's the approach that I've used in my interactions with Indigenous groups all over the Americas, from the Yucatan to the Northwest Territories. Even though I'm an Indigenous person, I'm from a First Nation, I'm a guest on the land, and I'm there to learn. And so it places these people, in a position of leadership. And that's what we mean by Indigenous-led research. That's the reality more and more, for researchers, for policymakers, is just recognizing that that special position of people. When you're interacting with a certain group, you're a guest on the land, and you're there to learn from them. So act accordingly, basically, is my advice.
That's amazing. Actually, that touches upon so many of the answers that I think people are giving. It's that face-to-face, the eye-to-eye, the taking into account the distinctions-based approach, the fact that we're Indigenous, but that doesn't mean we know everything about every Indigenous community out there. Every time we go, we travel, we are on other people's land, and we have to respect the protocols of those people. This is a question for anyone, and anyone can answer. So just whoever jumps in first wins the prize. What can you say about consultation processes with Indigenous communities for emergency management? What works, what could improve? And we can extend emergency management, I think, to other aspects of this discussion today about gathering data, about engaging on climate change. So would anyone like to jump in on that first and foremost? We don't want to bring in Robert.
let me just say simply that I mean, you can't wait until the day of the emergency to have those relationships. So again, if we look at disaster risk reduction, the stuff before the event is fundamental. Readiness and reduction, and part of the readiness component is training and relationships and resourcing and so on. So yeah, you don't want to look at your window and see the flames and go, oh, who's the local Indigenous leader, because that is too late.
Right on. Amy, I'm sure you have a perspective on this. And Miguel, there is a question directly for you, so I'm going to ask Amy if she has anything to add on this. And again, emergency management, as we know, has 4 components. It's just not the response and recovery. It is that preparation, the mitigation. So anything to add on that?
Yeah, well, I think for public servants, like C is like, are we talking big C consultation, or like the legal obligations?
It definitely has a little C. The question had a little C.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So yeah, with engagement, I would say the same as Simon. That it's really important to do that before the fact. And another thing is, with government, we also have like a lot of turnover of people, and that's very difficult for establishing those relationships and engaging. So, I mean, having someone there that can go to community repeatedly so that they're seeing the same face that's building up that trust, I think is so important. And we're not seeing that right now in many departments. I just wanted to quickly comment on the allyship thing too. So for me, I work with a lot of great allies in fire who I absolutely love working with. And I would say the difference I noticed there is that they really know what they want to do to support Indigenous nations. And it's not like come and learn from, everything our elders have to know when like youth, should be prioritized in that. Instead, what they're really focused on is looking at colonial institutions, systemic barriers, and really saying like, what are we doing? What do we have in place, that with a colonization that we can remove and that I can use in my power and my position or as an ally to do. So yeah, that's one thing that I would, hope people would consider. Like, it is cool to learn from elders, but, lots of our youth and other
Absolutely.
people also need to be prioritized there.
So much to unpack. I really like that. Miguel, this question for you directly that our listener has asked. Can you talk more about oral storytelling as a way of passing down ecological knowledge? What are some examples of communities that do this well? And is there a way for allies to respectfully learn from these traditions in a respectful way?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a very, very interesting question. And I think in terms of oral knowledge traditions, and like Amy was saying just a few minutes earlier, I think it all comes down to funding these days. You know, really, I think that's the essential element here is money. You know, you can't expect Indigenous communities or groups that have been dealing with the legacies and impacts of colonization, colonialism for the last few centuries, you know, and nowadays the new threat of climate change and environmental change that's going on, you know, at such a rapid rate, especially in the Canadian North, for instance, you know, in the subarctic, to deal with all of these pressures and all these historical legacies and impacts on their cultural knowledge systems, you know, to be able to handle these changes that are coming and to at the same time pass down these oral traditions over time. You know, it's becoming incredibly difficult for many Indigenous cultures from the Yucatan to the Northwest Territories, you know, and with the additional pressure and reality that more and more young people are leaving their communities, you know, to whether it's to seek employment in cities and towns outside of the community or educational opportunities, you know, and then some of them never come back. So I think that that's why I'm such a fan of Indigenous Guardians programs, like the Decho Guardians, for instance, that I'm familiar with in the Northwest Territories. You know, having some kind of financial incentive for people to remain in their communities, to stay on the land. That's how you preserve these oral knowledge systems and traditions, I think, through time, you know, is making it, you know, making it, I guess, attractive, you know, and just not even attractive, but possible for young people to stay in their communities and to continue learning from elders, you know, and to ensure that these knowledge systems are passed down from generation to generation. And you know, on the topic of money, I mean, you know, think about this: Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the world's population, and we manage over 80%, somewhere, you know, around 85% of global biodiversity. Right?
Yeah.
If that's not, you know, just a figure that can wake up the entire planet, you know, in terms of the critical role of Indigenous peoples in preserving global biodiversity and fighting global climate change, you know, mitigating the impacts. I think that just, you know, that figure of 85% of global biodiversity managed by 5% of the world population. I mean, that's certainly an economic incentive as well on a global level, you know, to allow Indigenous peoples to remain in their communities, to carry out their traditional land use practices over time, and to make sure that these systems of these oral knowledge traditions are passed down from generation to generation, right? I mean, it's just critically important, and I think that there's financial incentive, you know, as well as just a host of other reasons to allow Indigenous peoples just get out of the way, and then, you know, allow them to carry on their traditions as they've been doing for thousands of years, right?
Thank you. So really high level question on this. Do international instruments, example, the UN Declaration of Rights and Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, help to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is taken into account in the management of climate change, disasters, and environment? I'm going to look to Simon. You're the science.
Well, we all are.
Absolutely.
You know, Indigenous people are scientists first and foremost. It's UNDRIP, and Canada, hats off, has made probably the biggest strides, I think, internationally. That New Zealand is taking a step back at this stage. I mean, we have a simpler treaty system here. We have one treaty. We have a treaty settlement process that both my tribes have gone through. Internationally, you know, UNDRIP, I was in a Métis National Council Global Summit on the Sustainable Development Goals 3 weeks ago in Ottawa. Minister of Justice David Lametti spoke on this role, this changing interpretation role of UNDRIP, and said that it had got what he saw was a transition from UNDRIP being a shield to protect Indigenous peoples to it being a sword to enable First Nations, Métis, Inuit, specifically in Canada, to push forward and fight for more recognition of their inherent rights, treaty rights, Indigenous rights. And I thought that was an interesting turn of phrase. So legislation, and I have huge respect for lawyers. Yeah, we seem to have a heck of a lot of lawyers on the planet, but it is the modern fight now. It's better to be fighting in the courts than literally in the fields, which all our peoples have done, right? So we're in this new setting where these swords and shields, to extend the metaphor, come and go, and Indigenous peoples are very, very nimble and agile in recognizing tools to help us. And it's almost a kind of like just let us rip, let us rip. We can, there's the flag there.
I think that's the 2-minute warning.
I'll take it as that.
It wasn't, but I think that is a great spot for us. Hopefully that we didn't cut you off, Simon, but we are coming up to the end of our time, and I expect Robert any second now to be jumping in to thank all of our panelists. Amy, I wanted to come back to you. There was a few more questions, unfortunately, coming through. And I think that if anyone wants to get in touch with you, you do work for the Canadian government, and I know that your information is online, and that we can certainly reach out to you directly on some of the questions on, how do we bring everyone together, putting away the Indigenous, non-Indigenous schism. These are important questions that I think that you all could answer. And we've gone a little bit over on our questions, but I'm very happy with the way that the session went today. I think you're all three excellent panelists, and we have learned quite a bit today. If anything, I think it's just allowed viewers and listeners today to start to think about where they're going to go next. Where's the next step? What else can they do? And there's certainly been some great messages. So I'm looking to the folks here in the room, if Robert is coming on, to thank you.
And I am indeed.
There
yes, Todd. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you, Todd, and thank you especially for being our moderator for today's panel event. You did a wonderful job. Thank you so much. It's been a real privilege for me to be a sort of a bystander to not just today's panel session, but to 4 wonderful events that we've had as part of this series organized by the Canada School of Public Service on climate change and human migration. So today's was the 4th event, and truly, I think it is unique in that there are very few instances, to my knowledge, where we have had a panel of Indigenous experts speak to these very pressing issues in this sort of venue for public servants, not just in Canada, but anywhere else. And so I genuinely thank all of you for participating. For those of you who are joining us today, this is the 4th event. The first 3 are online or will be available as recordings very soon on the Canada School of Public Service YouTube channel. So just as a reminder for those who may not have participated in all of them, the first one was a global context look at climate change related displacements around the world. The second event was on displacement specific to Canada, about which we heard some examples today. And the third was on the challenges of the community of Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories, which is on the front lines of climate change and is unfortunately in the position of being one of the first communities in Canada to have to look directly in the face at relocating because of climate change. So I encourage everybody, if you have the opportunity, to visit the Canada School of Public Service YouTube channel. So again, merci beaucoup à tout le monde. On behalf of myself and the school, this concludes today's event. I would like to thank Todd, Amy, Simon, and Miguel, as well as everybody who participated in watching and in providing us with questions, for being part of today's discussion. Finally, again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful day.